Hey Knights! So I'm going to read the first and second chapter of Brilliant. And before I start this, in the very first video, or the intro video that I have, I forgot to mention that I did get help with picking it out because I was having issues enough trying to figure out if I wanted to do the Sherlock fanfiction first or the other two that I was debating between. So as soon as I'm done with this one, I will do one of the other two for the first three that I have picked out. So, to Robert, if you watch this, thank you for that help. Can't pick out, because there's so many good stories out there, so that's why I had asked. So, thank you for that help. Okay, so, to get into the story. Okay, so, Chapter 1. Brilliance is a matter of opinion. To the to the ordinary person with an ordinary mind, 221B Baker Street seemed like a quaint flat where nothing extraordinary occurred. Amelia Watson, however, was no ordinary person with an ordinary mind. She stood on the pavement, her long brown hair flying in the wind, and her sharp silver eyes examining the flat intently. She noticed the chips in the wood of the door frame and the scuff marks around the keyhole, all telltale signs of numerous forced entries. The green paint, so dark it was almost black, was even lighter under the brass knocker, which didn't hang straight, as if someone had deliberately placed it askew, not wanting to confirm the social norms. Of course, Amelia knew who lived here, and if the rumors rang true, the attendants of 221B Baker Street were not the type of people to conform to social norms. She let out a breath and glanced at the window above the door, furrowing her eyebrows when she saw the curtains flutter. Then she smiled as she rapped twice on the door. An elderly lady with graying blonde hair greeted Amelia. A golden cross on a matching chain hung around her neck, falling just above her sternum. Christian, all right, Amelia thought as she cleared her throat. Is John Watson here? The woman gave her a long look and then grinned. You must be Amelia, she said rather pertly. It's a pleasure to meet you, dear. Likewise, Amelia said quickly, never one for small talk. I can come back another time. Nonsense, the woman exclaimed, sounding genuinely offended. I'll put on the kettle. I was just going to anyways, and I'm sure John will be back soon. He ran out to the shop to get some food. Sherlock's a genius, but he's really quite absent-minded. But John's considerate and does it for him. Poor lad. Sherlock sometimes doesn't even pay the rent, even with the brother he has working for the government, making all that money. Mike, I believe it was. Mycroft, Amelia corrected, trying her hardest not to smile at the woman's ramblings. Good heavens, she sounded exasperated. What sort of ungodly name is that? Poor lad must have gotten a lot of teasing when he was younger. Now he's all bitter. Right, Amelia nodded once. Are you sure you don't want me to come back later? The woman waved her hand around in the air. Nonsense, dear. I'm sure Sherlock would appreciate the company of the youngest Watson. He is quite fond of them. Besides, with a pretty face like yours, I'm sure he'll like you, even if he is with your brother. John's not gay, said Amelia, biting back her laughter. And from what I've heard about Sherlock, I don't think he is either. Um, you should see the two of them around each other, dearie, said the woman happily, trotting off towards what Amelia deemed to be her kitchen. And if Sherlock gets stubborn, tell him Mrs. Hudson sent you. He'll have no choice but to let you in. Owes me a favor, that one does. Last month's rent was due, and he forgot about it entirely. Some days I think he'd be helpless if John wasn't there at all. Poor sod, she tutted, and shook her head, frowning at Amelia. Go on, then. He's upstairs, she said, shooing her off. Amelia pursed her lips and slowly started walking up the stairs, completely silent. She raised her hand to knock when a tall, thin man with cheekbones so high it made him look gaunt, a head full of curly black hair that appeared as if it hadn't been washed in a few days, and a pair of piercing blues opened the door, frowning when his gaze fell upon her. Well, he said in a deep baritone voice, you weren't what I was expecting. Too pretty. Amelia Watson, I presume. You're John's other sister, correct? He spoke quickly, and if Amelia didn't have to processing speed and the intelligent intelli- intelligence that she had, she would not have been able to understand a single word. Amelia blinked, didn't the slightest bit fazed by the detective. "Thank you," she said uncertainly. "Were you even listening to a thing I said?" inquired Sherlock, arcing his eyebrow. She was starting to get frustrated by his impertinence. "Just because I didn't have any comments does not mean that I was not listening to you, Mr. Holmes. This is no need to be rude about it," she snapped. Sherlock grinned at her response, seemingly finding it satisfactory, and pulled her into the room with him. He pointed at John's seat with one spindly finger. "Sit," he commanded. Sherlock watched her with narrow eyes, scrutinizing her, trying to understand what was going through her mind. She complied with his request and took a seat, legs pulled to the side, an impassive look on her face. Her fingers tapped against her knee, playing a silent melody only she could hear. Sherlock's eyes flicked to the book on quantum physics sticking out of her purse. "So," he started, taking a seat across from her. She glanced up at him and started laughing quietly before looking down at her lap. Sherlock frowned. "Is something funny, Miss Watson?" "No, no," she said, shaking her head. "Just you." She rose to her feet, striding over to the music stand located by the window. "Do you play?" She picked up a single piece of sheet music written in pen, humming the tune Sherlock had composed under her breath. "Yes," Sherlock answered simply, noticing the way she admired the curves of the wooden instruments. "Do you?" he asked walked to her side, picking up the violin and handing it to her, unsure why he was feeling so sentimental towards the youngest Watson. "I used to," she said quietly, "but I haven't for quite a long time." She turned it over in her hands and handed it back to him. She pulled back the curtains, peering out into the street below, where John had just gotten out of a cab, carrying several bags of grocery. She eyed his ever-graying hair. "Is that John? My God, he looks old." "Don't let him hear you say that," Sherlock said with a faint smile. "And I've often thought so myself, but he continues to refuse to dye his hair." Amelia gawped, covering her mouth with her hand in embarrassment. A red blush splattered across her cheeks, and she hid her face in her wispy brown hair. Sherlock reached over and tilted her chin up, looking into her silvery eyes, which only deepened her blush further. She mentally cursed his height. He was a good 6 inches taller than her, verging on 6 feet tall. She turned away from him as John sauntered into the room, hands in his pockets. His eyes met those of his sister's, his mouth breaking into a wide grin, stretching from one ear to the other. "Ames!" he said, pulling her into a large embrace. "Why do you sound so surprised to see me?" Amelia laughed. "You knew I was coming today." She shook her head in amusement as John let go of her. "I feel like I haven't seen you in ages." "That's because you haven't," Sherlock muttered, taking a seat in his armchair, fingers drumming on the armrests. "You have a tan line around your wrist. I imagine you're away for work. You have a very distinctly London accent. I presume you live here, so where would you get a tan from? Hasn't been warm enough to get a tan as strong as yours in a month, so you've been away." He got up and walked over to Amelia, pushing up the sleeve of her green pea coat further. "But it's faded. You've been back for a while, but you've been avoiding him. I wonder why that is." Amelia blinked lazily. "Is he always like this?" she asked, turning to her brother. "Annoying, cocky, and downright obnoxious?" "Most of the time, yeah," John nodded as he slipped off his own coat. Amelia handed him hers as well. He hung up both of the coats. "But if I recall correctly," "Which I doubt that he does," Sherlock interrupted, eyes flickering with amusement. John seemed not to have heard him, all too used to Sherlock's behavior. "You weren't much better," John finished. "At least it got me a job," Amelia shrugged. "But where?" Sherlock pressed, talking more to himself than to her. "Where do you work?" John chuckled, gesturing for his sister to take a seat at the desk, pulling out the chair for her. "I haven't seen him this confused since, well, never, actually, so thank you for that." Amelia shrugged again, not really quite sure what to say, instead glancing over at Sherlock, who was pacing around the small living room, muttering possibilities of Amelia's employer under his breath, nearly walking into John as the doctor attempted to take a seat in his own armchair. "Don't tell me," John began mockingly, as Sherlock's mutters began increasingly louder, and he paused to take breaths became as and his pauses to take breaths became shorter and more frantic. "The great Sherlock Holmes doesn't know?" "Shut up, John," Sherlock snapped angrily, shooting a glare at his friends. He huffed in frustration, practically collapsing in his armchair, long knobbly legs pulled up to his chest as he pouted like a spoiled child. He ruffled his hair in annoyance, still thinking. Then he reached under the cushion and pulled out a box of rather squished cigarettes. "Smoke, Amelia?" "Trying to quit, actually," Amelia said, eyes flicking to the nicotine patch on her inner arm. something that Sherlock had revealed while examining her tan line. Which you already knew, didn't you? Sherlock scuffed, feeling the slightest bit of offended by her underestimation of his skill. Of course I did. Yoo-hoo, said Mrs. Hudson, knocking the door twice as she came in, carrying a tray with a teapot printed with monarch butterflies, a matching ceramic milk pitcher, 3 teacups, and a sugar container to complete the set. I made tea. Thank you, Amelia said, smiling brightly at the elderly woman. But just this once, dear. I'm not the housekeeper, Mrs. Hudson reminded her. By Sherlock's slightly irritated-sounding grumbles, Amelia could tell that Mrs. Hudson said that all too often. Nevertheless, thank you. Why can't you be more like her, Sherlock? Mrs. Hudson said, pouring the 3 of them a cup of the steaming tea. It wouldn't be all too difficult. I have no attraction whatsoever to men. I am not about to become a woman, Sherlock muttered. Mrs. Hudson ignored him entirely and began doling out teacups on white saucers. Amelia took hers gratefully, nodding thanks, before proceeding to blow on her tea, not wanting to burn her tongue. Sherlock, on the other hand, swallowed a rather large mouthful, deliberately making slurping noises while doing so. Your mother has a lot to answer for, Mrs. Hudson said under her breath, walking out of the living room, shaking her head. Amelia took a sip from her tea, and then sat it on the floor underneath her chair. So, she began, turning to face John. What's it like living with him? Horrific, John said. Exciting, Sherlock said at the same time, immediately shooting John a glare when he realized what John had said. There was a short moment of silence before Sherlock broke it by saying, Please don't tell me you work for Scotland Yard. Amelia picked up her tea and then moved to sit on John's armrest. Not even close, she said. Amelia's met Sherlock's blue-green eyes, giving him a small wink before accidentally knocking her tea into John's lap. The doctor let out a yelp as the scalding liquid seeped through the fabric of his trousers, jumping to his feet. Amelia's hand flew up to her mouth, eyes widening in fake sincerity. John, I'm so sorry. It was an accident. Sherlock picked up on her lie, but remained silent, instead wondering what on earth her motives were. John gritted his teeth in a smile. I'm going to go change, he said indifferently. John sighed heavily, then went upstairs to his room, wincing with every step. Why'd you do that? Sherlock said, once John was out of earshot, then added, Why won't you tell me what you do for a living? Are you unemployed? Amelia narrowed her eyes. I work with your brother, you daft idiot. But John doesn't know that, and I'm not planning on telling him. So unless you want me to sick your brother on you, I would suggest keeping your mouth shut. Sherlock was surprised by her sudden change of demeanor. He thought her to be a delicate, fragile person, the sort of girl who'd fret over a broken fingernail or hair growing out unevenly. You said with, not for, Sherlock observed calmly. He's a colleague, not my boss. You've had to be brilliant to work with my brother. He has an even lower tolerance for idiots than I do. Who says I'm not? Amelia said cockily, raising one eyebrow. She smiled smugly, folding her arms over her chest, as John came back into the room, wearing a pair of beige khakis. Amelia crossed one leg over the other, watching Sherlock intently as John took a seat in his chair, which had miraculously not been affected by the tea incident. John glanced between Sherlock and Amelia, the tension between them so thick it was palpable. Palpable? What did I miss? Chapter 2. Dinner Dates. Are you planning on staying long? Sherlock inquired, eyes flickering to the clock, which was ever so slowly inching towards 7. Amelia didn't seem to have brought any overnight clothes. He doubted that they could fit in the small clutch she was carrying. Amelia made a small, indifferent noise. I don't know. I wasn't exactly planning on it. I have some flats I'm looking into buying. You could always just stay with us, Ames, John offered. Sherlock sleeps on the sofa most nights, if he even sleeps at all. John looked over at Sherlock, slightly worried that he'd object. The detective lifted his shoulders flippantly, not overly caring what the Watsons did and didn't do. She can stay, as long as she cleans. He jerked his head toward the kitchen table, where a dozen or so experiments were set up. That up, and helps pay the rent. Amelia smiled. I can do that. Sherlock nodded. Excellent. When are we going for dinner? I'm assuming we're going out. We don't have much in our fridge. I was thinking Chinese, suggested John. Amelia's allergic to soy sauce, Sherlock said, just as Amelia opened her mouth to speak, his eyes downcast to his phone as he scrolled through a list of the various restaurants located nearby. I have a mouth, and I can speak for myself. Thank you very much, Amelia said, not bothering to ask how he knew of her allergy, well aware that he'd only give her a cryptic answer in response. She collected everyone's teacups, carrying them to the kitchen. She moved a bucket of sheep livers, or at least she thought them to be sheep livers, from out of the sink, placing it to the side as she began to rinse out the cups. Should I ask why there are livers in the sink? Experiment, Sherlock said simply. Ah, was all that she said, wiping her hands on the towel. So are we actually going to go to dinner or just sit here talking about it? Italian food, Sherlock declared, leaping to his feet. In one fluid motion, he had already gotten his long navy bell-staff coat, which had been draped over the back of the chair around his shoulders, and proceeded to tie his scarf, which had been tucked in between the cushion and the seat, alongside the cigarettes from earlier, around his neck. There's a smiley face on the wall. Yes, do you like it? Sherlock said, grinning. He tossed Amelia's coat to her, pausing only to sniff the fabric, nostrils flaring at the scent of her jasmine perfume. She caught it with ease, surprising him. Come along, Watsons. Sherlock turned sharply on his heel and began trotting down the stairs, 3 at a time. I have a name, she called out after him, rolling her silvery eyes, as John followed after the detective, like some sort of lost puppy. In reality, a lost hedgehog would be a better description. Amelia sighed, zipping up the coat before going downstairs to join them. Sherlock was starting to get impatient. They had been escorted to a table by the maître but the waiter still hadn't shown up. John looked perfectly content sitting in his chair while flipping through the menu, being utterly boring, in Sherlock's opinion. Amelia, however, was drumming her fingers on the table in a steady beat, although occasionally her tapping would become more frantic and then gradually return back to normal. After 2 minutes of observing her, Sherlock realized that Amelia was in fact tapping the corresponding notes to the piano playing at the far end of the room. Her eyes met his, slightly startled by the fact that he had been watching her the entire time. Her fingers immediately stopped moving, resting in her lap instead. Where's the waiter? Sherlock growled, scanning the room. He got to his feet, nodding at the Watsons. Please excuse me, I shall be right back. Sherlock, sit back down, John said sternly, already fed up with the curly-haired detective. The waiter will be here soon. Sherlock ignored him entirely, casually buttoning up his charcoal black blazer and walking away. Amelia fiddled with a loose strand of unraveling from the seam of her jacket sleeve while scanning the menu. A loud bang came from the other side of the restaurant, once muffled voices raising to loud shouts, and within those voices Amelia could distinctly hear Sherlock. She let out a heavy sigh. Does he always do this? She asked her older brother. His silent exploration was the only answer she needed. Fantastic, Amelia said sarcastically, pinching the bridge of her nose, as Sherlock, with a lovely new purple blues brimming across his left cheek, reappeared with the waiter and someone who appeared to be the manager in tow. She bit back laughter. I found the waiter, Sherlock declared almost proudly. We noticed, said John, giving the manager and the waiter an apologetic smile. My sincerest apologies for our friends. He's not great with people. Our friend? Amelia scoffed. I met him 4 hours ago. He hardly classifies as my friend, John. Oh, shut up, Amy, Sherlock said, taking a seat, completely oblivious to the heated looks the manager was giving him. Did you just call me Amy? She asked in disbelief. He didn't respond, instead turning to the waiter and rattling off in a perfect Italian accent. I'll have the fettuccine porcini in a glass of the 1968 Monsantano. He handed the menu back to the waiter, raising his eyebrow at the youngest Watson. You? Amelia cleared her throat. The Ganucci, please, and just some water. Make that 2 waters and a salmon for me, thanks, John said. The waiter scribbled down the last order, taking both Amelia and John's menu, before heading back to the kitchen. The manager huffed indifferently, then followed after the waiter. So, John started, leaning forward and clasping his hands on the table before him. What exactly did you do to get the manager and waiter to want to rip your throat out? Sherlock ignored him entirely, glancing toward Amelia. Piano, he said suddenly. Amelia blinked in confusion. Sorry? Piano, Sherlock repeated monotonously, as if the word took him a great deal of effort to say. Do you play it? His eyes flicked down towards her hands. I used to, Amelia confirmed, smiling slightly. I had to sell my piano and my violin when I moved back here. Where were you living before? Sherlock asked, taking a sip from the wine the waiter had just delivered. New York, John and Amelia said at the same time. Amelia grinned at her brother, turning to Sherlock and continuing on. 4 months. Explains the rudeness, Sherlock muttered quietly, jaw muscles twitching as Amelia kicked him under the table, her toe of her back palms digging into his shin. Just then, the food arrived. Amelia smiled to herself before digging into her pasta, discreetly stealing some of Sherlock's fettuccine off of his plate. He noticed her and shot her a glare out of the corner of his eye. Amelia hummed as she swallowed. That's pretty good. I should have ordered that. Sherlock switched her plate with his. Here, have mine. John raised his eyebrow curiously as Amelia looked down at her lap, blushing. Thank you. Chapter 3. Apologies, Death Cards, and Metaphors. Amelia collapsed on the sofa, kicking her feet up onto the table as Sherlock and John stepped into the living room. She pulled out a thick brown envelope from her inner coat and threw it alongside her feet. Sherlock frowned down at it. Money for Mycroft, Amelia clarified, idly examining her cuticles. How does she know Mycroft? John said, catching the last bit of Amelia's words. How does she even know about Mycroft? He narrowed his eyes, turning towards his sister. Are we even talking about the same Mycroft? Sherlock untied his scarf, throwing it on the seat beside Amelia. It would appear so. He sat the kettle on, threw 3 tea bags into 3 mismatching mugs, and then returned back to the living room. He leaned down and tore open the envelope, revealing the several bundles of money hidden within. He eyed them warily, and then answered John's questions. She works with Mycroft, John. Amelia glared at him. She works for him, John repeated slowly, not believing that his sister works for the British government, let alone Sherlock's brother. Especially since Amelia rarely ever stopped complaining about whoever was Prime Minister, or whatever was going on in Parliament at the time. With him, not for him, Sherlock corrected quickly, pushing Amelia's feet off the table and started to divide the money into 3 separate piles. God, you're infuriating. How does anyone put up with you? Amelia said angrily, letting out a huff before storming to Sherlock's bedroom, slamming the door shut behind her. She gets quite offended if you say for. Sherlock watched her as she left, entirely unfazed, then turned back to distributing the money. John, however, wasn't quite sure how to react, unable to wrap his head around the new revelation. He knew his sister was clever. She'd even gone and attended Cambridge, but he didn't expect her to be smart enough to work with Mycroft. Surely he and Sherlock weren't talking about the same person. Ames doesn't work for the government. She does, actually. I ran it by Mycroft during the ride back. Amelia Laura Watson, born January 25th, 1973. Yes, she's been employed to him, or rather, with him, for 3.5 years in May, Sherlock said simply, heading to the kitchen as he realized the kettle had finished boiling. He poured water into 2 mugs, then hesitated over the third one before proceeding to fill it anyways. Christ, John said, running a hand through his graying hair. He blew out a breath. That's impressive. John could hardly say anything else. Working with Mycroft, and not for, was quite a substantial achievement, and she thinks she's the most boring and ordinary girl on the planet. Sherlock stirred milk into all 3 teas absent-mindedly. Both you and I know that's not true. He handed John's mug to him and grabbed the third one, leaving his own on the table. Excuse me for a moment. He walked to his room and knocked on the door. When no response came from the brunette inside, Sherlock set the tea on the floor and pulled out his phone. He'd cash in on a favor Mycroft had owed him to get information on Amelia, and that information just so happened to contain her number. I made tea for you, however milky it may be. It's outside the door. S.H. He let out a breath before sending another message. You have my apologies. Inside the room, Amelia laughed quietly as she read the message. She waited until she heard Sherlock walk away and began to quietly talk to John about something or another before she opened the door. Sure enough, a mug of tea sat in the hallways, practically beckoning her. She took it back into the room, perching on the end of Sherlock's bed, running a hand over the cream-colored sheets. She sipped her tea quietly, eyes scanning the room. The small space was sparsely decorated, a periodic table of the elements hanging up on the wall behind the door, and something written in what appeared to be Mandarin pinned on the space above the bed. A lamp had been pushed into the corner by the window, although she could tell by the other circular marks in the hardwood floor that had been moved several times. A medium-sized wardrobe sat alone in the opposite corner, and Amelia was surprised to see that the clothes were not spilling out of it. All in all, Sherlock's room was far cleaner than the kitchen. Amelia took another sip from her tea before pulling out her phone. Thank you, Amelia. You are most welcome, S.H. Amelia smiled slightly, and opened the Kobo mobile app, lying back on Sherlock's bed and beginning to read George Orwell's 1984. Sherlock woke to the sound of a distinctly feminine voice clearing her throat. Lazily, he opened his eyes to see Amelia standing before him, one hand on her hip and the other holding a cup of steaming coffee. Black, 2 sugars, Amelia said, handing it to him. Sherlock sat up on the floor, swinging his legs over the side. He took it from her, eyes flickering to the now organized kitchen. Not a single piece of science equipment in sight, save for his microscope tucked away alongside the electric kettle in the corner. I've designated space in the cupboards for your equipment, Amelia said. I cleared out a pantry and put all your various non-perishable things in it. Make sure all your assets are on the bottom shelf of the pantry in a glass container. Sherlock was slightly taken back by her thoroughness, and he found himself speechless and then took a drink from the bitter coffee. Body parts? I separated the fridge into two sections. Food and your experiments. You get the bottom half of the fridge, and everything should be in airtight bags. Anything else that could theoretically poisonous. Amelia pointed to the cupboard under the sink. Goes in the mini fridge. We don't have a mini fridge. We do now. Sherlock sipped his drink, warmth flooding his body. I'm impressed, he said truthfully. I didn't expect you to clean my mess up this early. Sherlock checked his mental clock. It was nearly 8. It's 8, Amelia said, unknowingly confirming Sherlock's estimation. It's not that early. Besides, it's not like I had anything else to do. She jerked her head towards the kitchen. There's some breakfast in the food fridge if you want it. Sherlock chuckled. Yes, thank you. Amelia nodded and went to retrieve the food. Sherlock followed after her, exploring through the cupboards and trying to locate his equipment. Amelia covered his food and put it in the microwave, then sat down on the counter, her feet swaying. Have a nice sleep, she scratched at her right arm. Sherlock ignored her questions and instead pulled her sleeves to reveal the simple tattoo of the Ace of Spades card. He ran a finger over the slightly raised black ink. The death card, he murmured. Amelia hesitantly pulled her sleeve back down, just as the microwave beeped. Oh, look, the food's ready. She forced a wide and obvious fake smile to her lips, then skipped to the microwave. She placed the plate on the table before walking out of the room without a further word. Sherlock watched her leave, slowly sitting down. Curious, he said to himself, and curiouser. Bloody psychopath you are, Amelia shouted at Sherlock. She just returned from getting some milk from the local store. Sherlock was too stubborn to go, and John had refused to go. But when she returned, Sherlock had taken the milk carton out of her hand, then stabbed a knife through the plastic, the creamy liquid spilling onto the carpeted floor. Today officially marked her 3rd day at 221B, and after finding out that her belongings were going to be delayed flying in from New York, Amelia was ready to rip her hair out. Of course, she still tried to behave politely. She even managed to keep a straight face when Sherlock accidentally hit her in the face with the bow of his violin, not realizing she was dusting behind him. But the milk she'd had to walk to go buy, was simply unacceptable. No, I'm a highly functioning sociopath who lives with you, Sherlock corrected, holding up a finger. Oh, for God's sake, you two, John exclaimed in exasperation, finally looking up from his newspaper. Stop fighting. He's being insufferable, Amelia objected. I'm being insufferable, Sherlock said, disbelief. You weren't listening when I said that I needed milk for an experiment. You said no such thing. I did. Jesus bloody Christ, John said loudly, slamming his hands down on the side table with a loud bang. Both Amelia and Sherlock jumped and ceased their bickering. You two need to leave the flat for a while. That's what you need to do. Go out, solve some murders or something. Both of you are being insufferable. There's no need to be rude, Amelia grumbled under her breath. He's always like this. Get used to it, Sherlock said to her quietly. Really. Unfortunately. John sighed. At least Amelia and Sherlock had already made up. They were both so similar in so many ways that he expected nothing less from the two of them. Of course, that also meant he'd have to put up with the constant fighting and the hypothesizing during the middle of the night, but at least neither of them would be bothering him. I'm going out, John declared slowly. You two, go do something. He got to his feet and headed out the door, muttering profanities under his breath. Where's he going? Amelia asked Sherlock, watching her brother leave and hail a cab from the window. Girlfriends. Sarah, was it? Sherlock said, not entirely sure what her name was. I can't remember. I don't keep track of irrelevant things. He told me you do that, Amelia smiled, collapsing on the sofa. Is it really true that you don't know the earth goes around the sun? Oh, for heaven's sakes, not that again, Sherlock groaned, picking up his violin and started to play the first 4 bars of a song he was in the middle of composing. He hadn't gotten any further with the song, and he wasn't quite sure why. Lacking motivation, or was he simply not inspired? Sherlock glanced over at Amelia, furrowing his brows before scribbling down a few more bars. You're going to Belarus tomorrow, aren't you? Amelia inquired, watching him. Yes. Why? Sherlock set down the pencil, giving her a long look. Man named Barry Barrett killed his girlfriend, doesn't know why. Psychotic breakdown, perhaps, Amelia suggested coolly. Could easily be mild form of late-developing schizophrenia. Also could quite easily be some sort of dissociative amnesia. Get it? Gets in fight with girlfriend, kills her, feels guilty, then represses the memory of why he killed her. Sherlock blinked at her theory, considering her rather hypothesis. He said thoughtfully, wondering if Amelia, with all the time she spent working with Mycroft, was any good at psychology. He started to play the song again. What's that called? Amelia said, eyebrows raised. It's nice. Doesn't have a name yet, said Sherlock. I'm still working on it. He cleared his throat and filled in another bar. He let out a breath, then flipped back to one of his older songs and played that instead, dancing around the small living room while doing so, Amelia watching him silently and giggling. He turned around to face her, sniffing the air. Did you burn my cigarettes? Sherlock glanced towards the fireplace, where there was a fresh pile of ashes that was definitely not there the night before. Yes, Amelia said calmly, pulling out her phone and scrolling through her emails. Revenge for telling John about my job. It's not like it endangered anyone, Sherlock pointed out. Burning cigarettes? A bit redundant, isn't it? It's a metaphor. Amelia laughed at Sherlock's scowl, not surprised that he didn't understand her reference. Read the books, Holmes. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Peace out, Knights.